So now I've completed that review, and now we're talking about what happens with the English. Well, at first, when the Manchus, the king, came to power, they closed the borders. They wouldn't allow any trade at all. And the reason for this was because southern China was the area where there were these contacts with with the foreigners, and some of the foreigners had tried to help the survivors of the Ming government. They plotted against the overthrow of the Ming dynasty, and in retaliation, the new dynasty absolutely closed the borders. There was no trade for a few years. However, by 1685, the situation changed, and it was the English East India Company that was the main beneficiary. The same company we saw active in India. And between 1685 and 1760, the regime permitted the English, in particular, and the French and some others, the Dutch also allowed, but in southeastern China, where even today, that's the well, there's industrialization everywhere in China, but this area of Southeast China, close to Hong Kong, is the area of that I'm talking about. It was the English East India Company which was most involved. And of all of these sort of ports that were involved in this, it was the port of Canton in southeastern China, which was the center of this foreign trade. And the English East India Company, which was the major foreign player, it couldn't directly sell to Chinese people. There was a merchant guild, a Chinese merchant guild in Canton, and basically the company did business through this guild who had a monopoly, basically. These rich Chinese merchants had a monopoly. And more and more, Canton became the focal point. Now, what was traded? Well, we know porcelain and silk, which we saw was basic since the 16th century, but also people elsewhere, especially in Europe, there was a craze for Chinese medicine. The Chinese know how to cure disease. They're a medicine. And we see that today, even, there's a lot of people who go to Chinese doctors. I've never personally tried it, but I might, as I deteriorate, I might give it a go because you become desperate. So why not try anything? Those are the things that the English exported to Europe, to England, but especially tea. Tea, a vast tea trade developed in the 18th century. Now, the English had to pay the Chinese for these things, and they wanted to sell them English woolens. England, by this point, well, since the 16th century, was the major wool producer in Europe, the manufacturer, since Henry VIII. And so their idea was, well, we'll sell the Chinese woolens. The Chinese would not buy it. They regarded this stuff as, in terms of their climate, in terms of what they were accustomed to wear, they were not interested. Nor could the English interest the Chinese in lead and tin. There were big lead and tin mines in England. They sold to many places. They sold these minerals to many places, but no, the Chinese were not interested. By this point, the English East India Company was the dominant in the whole of the trade of Asia, Indonesia, the Philippines. And so they tried Asian products. They tried to bring in Asian products to pay the Chinese, like pepper and rice from Indonesia, cottons from India, what have you. But although the Chinese did buy a little bit, nothing significant. So the English in the end had to pay silver. Again, the silver was what the Chinese wanted. The Indians wanted gold. The Chinese want silver. Now, the net result of this, there was not only a balance of trade problem for England with respect to China, which was serious because especially the growth in the tea trade, but a balance of payments problem. That means to say it's not merely an imbalance of products, but it's an imbalance of money. More money is flowing out of England than is coming in. So the English were very anxious to correct this situation, and they sent a representative in 1793. He had to come to Beijing and sort of kowtow to the emperor. It was the only way you could be received. And there he presented a letter from George III, who was the reigning king in England at the time, basically asking for two things: that diplomatic relations between China and England be regularized. That is to say, there should be an equal exchange of ambassadors, as was the custom in England and in Europe. I explained that the system of ambassadors between sovereign states was the norm in Europe by the time of Machiavelli. But in China, the tributary system. Well, the Chinese rejected that idea. And furthermore, they said, we're not really interested in further expanding economic relations. And why was that? Well, in the emperor's letter, he said this: there is nothing in China that we lack, nor do we need any more of your manufactures, quote unquote. In other words, what he was, well, it was sort of a tone of superiority, obviously, but in a certain sense it was true, because I explained that China was largely self-sufficient. So the English had to pay in silver. And as I've already mentioned, it was the tea trade which was particularly making the situation bad. Now, let's talk a little bit about tea. Tea, of course, had long been an important beverage in China, but it really caught on in Europe at the end of along with coffee, toward the end of the 17th century, and it was the Dutch, in particular, who brought in both tea and coffee and started the craze for drinking tea and coffee. In 1664, the first shipment of tea arrived in England, and very quickly a huge demand for tea developed even amongst the emerging working class in England. People began to drink tea, especially in the morning. And indeed, what we see is that tea and coffee and tobacco, not only in England, but all across Western Europe, tobacco, tea, and coffee become stimulants, regular consumer items. Of course, there's a vast number of poor people who can't afford anything, but those who can afford, and include prosperous members of the working class, they begin to consume these things. And historians, what they say is that the rhythm of capitalism as a system, the rhythm of capitalism is more accelerated than in hunting and gathering and in tributary or feudal societies. And therefore, in order to cope, like this morning, everybody here, no, I shouldn't say everybody, I certainly did. I had really strong coffee in the morning. I know it's not that good for me and so on, but I still need that coffee to get going because we all have to get going. I have to show up here. I have to put myself together. You should see me. I'm a wreck. And I'm sure you look funny too. So, and one of the ways we cope is we have this coffee. Well, amongst the English, it was tea. This is the way people began to drink coffee as well, but tea was more popular. And so, as I said, the tea trade grew, the balance of trade grew worse, and from the point of view of the English government, what was worse was the English government attempted to tax this trade so that they could sort of deal with this imbalance in some way. And there was a lot of tax evasion, contraband, illegal. There was a kind of illegal trade in tea in England in the 18th century. Now, given this problem, the English government, of course, by this point, the English have a colonial empire, right? So they get the idea that in order to make the empire pay its way, they impose a tea tax on the American colonies. They attempt to, they also impose what was called the stamp tax on the American colonies. And as you probably know, a great hue and cry developed in these colonies along the eastern coast about no taxation without representation. The colonies didn't have representation in the English Parliament. The English Parliament was imposing these things. And there were other factors as well. For example, the English, who had conquered the French by 1763, they prohibited the movement of American colonists across the Appalachians into Aboriginal country. This is a huge issue in Canada. The English Colonial Office, the monarchy there was a big debate going on, and sort of protecting the Aboriginals. Let's not exaggerate how lovely the English colonial government was, or idealize them, but they were worried about the expansion of the white colonists into Aboriginal land. And this was probably the most important issue. In any case, the hotheads, the so-called patriots in Massachusetts reacted by basically what was called the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Tea Party, maybe some of you know about this, they dumped huge amounts of tea off an English ship in the harbor of Boston. And this was one of the immediate lead-ups to the outbreak of the American Revolution. So that was the most important consequences. Another consequence was that the Americans turned to coffee. So we have Starbucks as a result. But the Americans had been drinking tea, and they boycotted tea, and they started to drink coffee. So silver continued to pour into China. The English East India Company and the and the English government were at their wits' end, and then they discovered an answer. In India, one of the products produced in India, amongst many, many other things, was opium. And opium was a significant product in India. People consumed it for pleasure, but also it was used for sometimes various groups used it for religious purposes. You know that some drugs, for example, amongst the Aboriginals, traditionally certain drugs were used as they people thought that they were having sort of religious experiences by consuming some drugs. Maybe somebody is smiling there because, oh yes, I'm taking a trip, and I spend the whole night. I take an overload of marijuana, and you're flying. That's what I'm talking about. So this did happen in India, and it was particularly there was a lot of that kind of stuff in Indochina, what is called Indochina, Laos, and parts of Vietnam. And as it happened, there was a certain interest in this kind of stuff in China. The Mughal government had made the selling of opium a government monopoly because you got revenue. And the company decided to try and market more opium in China. And in particular, the East India Company had a relationship with a certain religious merchant sect known as Parsis. They go back to antiquity, the Parsis. Very, very old. I believe, no, it's not Christian. They go back to a sort of dualism, I think, is the basis of their theology. Parsi, Parsi. This is in key words, by the way. Opium caught on big time in China. The company began to land more and more opium in China from the 1780s. Large amounts of opium began to arrive in Canton. And indeed, the Americans, who were themselves, especially in New England, Yankee traders, the American colonists were building big ships, clippers, and they were rivaling the British on the high seas. They were beginning to trade everywhere, and there was a certain guy by the name of Henry Yale, who was one of these big merchants, and he decided that, he had no access to India, that was English, but that he would, opium was being produced in Turkey, in the Ottoman Empire. So he began to ship Turkish opium on these big Yankee clippers all the way around through the Pacific to China. Henry Yale, his name is. And he's the guy who founded Yale University. The Americans are only now beginning, the big American universities are beginning to, and indeed the English universities, trying to cope with what their real past was in terms of this kind of stuff, but also, of course, the African slave trade. Big money was made at the expense of the African people by Harvard, Yale, Princeton, you name it. So it was. Well, it turned out that the Chinese especially in southern China, where this activity was most of the time, had a real taste for, they liked cigarettes and opium. Really, the sale of opium exploded, almost to the degree of the cannabis shops in Winnipeg. It's sort of interesting, these shops in Winnipeg and so on, and the cannabis and so on. It is related to what is happening in the society, our society. Now, don't get me wrong. Once in a while in my life, I have enjoyed a joint. I confess that. It's legal. It's legal now. You can do that. But one notices, it's everywhere, all over Canada, and of course the government is making money out of this. But it is related to, it does help people to get along in an increasingly stressful society. And I think we should understand that there's the policymakers see this, they see things, and it helps sort of pacify people and etc. We should be aware. Listen, it's important to be aware. What is really happening and why and who's doing this to me. These are fundamental to getting along in the society. Back to the narrative. In any case, the trade exploded, and of course, as the opium trade expanded more and more, it became criminalized. All kinds of gangs and henchmen and bodyguards became involved. More and more violence, and literally millions of people in southern China became addicted to opium. To the point where, and this was significant, that in the 1830s, for the first time in Chinese history, whereas all through the period that we're considering, the balance of trade and the balance of payments of China were always in favor of China. But the amount of opium going into China by the 1830s was so great that historically the balance of payments, the amount of silver leaving China to pay for the opium, exceeded the balance of the positive balance of silver entering China for tea and porcelain and all the other stuff. This clearly reflects the fact that the economic position of China in an increasingly integrated global economy is seriously deteriorating. Well, how did the regime in Beijing respond? Well, in the first place, in response to this, they eventually responded by trying to prohibit the trade. The first response was basically to increase taxes because the government depended on silver to run its administration, pay its officials. And so the government increased taxes on the Chinese population to basically maintain government revenues. And of course, given what was overall happening in Chinese society, this was a very serious thing for the Chinese government to do, to raise taxes in the face of the overpopulation had now reached huge levels, 360 million people. The food supply for this population was increasingly in question because the agriculture was not productive, landlordism, overexploitation, overtaxation, the peasants are sinking, and there's rampant corruption and the opium trade all over, particularly the south of China. Now, at this point in 1839, the emperor issues a decree in which basically he prohibits the opium trade. The opium trade is prohibited. And the English say, in response, of course, enormous profits have accrued to England as a result. They say that this is an interference with free trade. They say it's an interference with free trade. Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations in 1776, and the English are converted to the idea of free trade. Free trade is a religious principle. Let's understand that. It's a religious principle. You read Charles Dickens, who was the master of what the English believed at the beginning, especially the upper classes, by the early years of the 19th century, where they had clearly emerged as the top dog in Europe and the top dog in the world based on English capitalism. And Adam Smith was the Bible. Free trade was a divine principle. And so, of course, this was basically a veneer for the fact that they wanted to maintain their profits. And so there was tension and war broke out. This is called the First Opium War. The First Opium War, 1839 to 1842, and English Marines and big English warships. By this point, these ships are still using sail, but they are incredibly sophisticated. And the Chinese had their traditional vessels and their traditional ways of fighting, and the English wiped the floor with them, and the English could not, the Chinese could not resist. A treaty was signed in 1842 conceding the port of Hong Kong permanently or for the next 100 years to England, and it was subsequently revived and prolonged. And other treaty ports were opened up, and the English government imposed a huge indemnity on China. This was the beginning of what the Chinese referred to as the century of humiliation. And this is just the beginning. One should say something about how one can make a judgment. If you're a historian, the common view of historians has been that history has to be objective. History should be objective. You cannot do history if you come to the subject with violent prejudices. It's not possible to do it because you're blinded. You can't see the facts. And so history developed as a discipline. Its fundamental principle was objectivity. Well, it turns out that this, in fact, is philosophically, well, one can attempt to be objective, but objectivity is impossible when it comes to human affairs. Even if we take the case of Machiavelli, who said, I'm showing you things in politics as they are, not what the rulers say, not what the church says, but as they are. Machiavelli's realistic perspective is also a moral perspective. This amoralism is a position. It's an ethical position, amoralism. So there's no escape from judgment of some sort. Of course, people try, and it's important to try as much as possible. And I would argue, let me take this a step further, that even in physics or any of the hard disciplines, we see that in practice, in terms of the development of these sciences and their continuing development today, that certain things are funded. certain things are funded in engineering, certain things are funded in um, medicine. And it turns out the things that really get the funds are the things that the big people with money, the capitalists who control Canada and the rest of the West, they fund research um, which essentially is potentially profitable. This is what they do. I'll give you, since we have a few minutes, I'll give you an example, a personal example. As it happened, I was, at the time this happened, I was married into a family. They had to happen to have a lot of money, these people. And um, the, um, the family was related to one of the vice presidents of the Great West Life Company. And, we would meet for Thanksgiving and so on. I didn't really have not much to do with these people, but, you know, you go on these family occasions. And so I went to this dinner, and this vice president was there, and we got into. He says, "Oh, Henry, I met somebody who knows you." So it turns out that the guy he met was the president of the University of New Brunswick, who a former graduate of the history department here in Manitoba. And this guy had been, in those days, back in the day, this president of the University of New Brunswick was a political radical amongst many students. And he had turned his life in a certain direction, and he emerges as the president of the University of New Brunswick. And they begin talking, and it turns out they know me. So um, uh, I said to him, "Well, how did you meet this president?" And so he says, "Well, the medical school down there is going around. The president, is raising money for the medical school, and this guy's asking for several millions of dollars from the Great West Life Company." So this vice president explains that the guy said that one of the areas that New Brunswick Medical School is interested in is the environment, ecological research. And so this guy, this vice president, says to me, "We're not interested in that. We don't want that." So what I'm telling you is that, yes, research, disinterested research, but what gets funded and what doesn't get funded, it all depends. Well, last remarks next time.